Hi everyone. My name is Haakon, and I head customer analytics in If. I'm actually 4 weeks into parental leave right now, so most of my conversations go along the lines of cow says moo and sheep says ba. So talking about data science and analytics is a bit of a shift in topic for me today, but I'll do my best. I joined If about 5 years ago, and this happened to be right about the same time that a large change program was initiated within If Private. The key kind of 3 focus areas for this change program where we wanted to instigate a change was customer orientation, digital first, and truly Nordic. If is a Nordic insurance company. What I thought I would do today is focus especially on the first of those, the customer orientation part, and talk a bit how that has influenced how we do analytics in If. I'll be focusing quite a bit on the, let's say, KPI, communication, analysis part of this, not so much on the ML and AI part, although there are a lot of examples I could have used there as well. But hopefully there'll be a little bit of interesting stuff for all of you. Let's see if this works. So yeah, I want to set the stage a little bit, and in order to do that, we're going to go back to 1999, when If was essentially founded through a merger of Skandia in Norway and Skandia in Sweden and Storebrand in Norway. Now, from the offset, profitability was the kind of the key focus in If, and it was also a kind of a key struggle. And this focus on kind of how to do pricing, how to design the tariffs, how to attain profitability gave rise to what we today know as the best in risk culture. There was a lot of focus on how to do the pricing. We became very good at it, and I would say that we became, and we still are, leading within the field of pricing within insurance. But then today, If has more than 3.1 million customers in the Nordics. The business area of private constitutes about 55% of our gross written premium for a typical year. And top management discovered a few years back that just having this best in risk focus is not going to take us where we want to go. And the change program was started, and customer orientation took kind of the first seat. And I think today this is, I won't spend any time here now arguing to you about why customer orientation is important. I think it's one of those things that we all take for granted these days, but a few years back it wasn't quite so obvious. Now this switch in focus had a big impact on the entire organization, but also within the area of analytics, and that's where I want to focus a little bit today. So this is meant to be a little bit funny, but it's not too far from the truth if we go a little bit back in time. We were very advanced in pricing. We were utilizing a lot of different data. We had a lot of experience figuring out what data we could and couldn't use. We experimented a lot with different methods to do pricing, to design the tariffs. The entire system and setup was and still is quite complicated. Whereas if you look at kind of the areas of sales, CRM, and these parts of the business, things were a lot more basic. This was also reflected quite a bit in how both the company was organized in terms of analytics, in terms of people, but also in terms of our data. If you look at people, the analysis kind of parts of the organization were typically organized within the respective countries. Pricing and tariffs are very different depending on the markets in the Nordics, so it makes sense to focus on that separately within the countries. And it was also built very much around our products. So the analysts would typically be built around, the motor product or something like that. Same thing holds true in terms of our data. Data was typically organized around our product structure, around our tariffs and coverages and lines of insurance, and then also similarly on a very kind of monthly snapshot basis, the data you need to do your pricing models to understand risk. Now, as we shifted to kind of customer orientation, one thing that happened was that a lot of new KPIs suddenly were, let's say, dragged into the limelight. If you go back a bit, the key focus in terms of KPIs were things like gross written premium, so the total premium that we write for a year, risk ratio, cost ratio, combined ratio, these things. I won't go into what they are. People who work within insurance know what they are. It's related to kind of how your profitability works. We had KPIs in terms of very basic stuff like how many customers do we have, what is our retention rate, but they weren't. Firstly, they didn't really receive much attention. They weren't kind of a key focus area. Secondly, nobody really trusted them because they changed a lot. We couldn't quite explain how they were made. They were very different, multiple sources, etc. So with this new shift, organizationally, there were a few changes. A new team was set up. It became a Nordic team because, if you remember, the other pillar of this change program was truly Nordic. This was an area where we saw that we could do a lot of Nordic synergies. I'm oversimplifying a lot, but this is kind of the short story. And new reports were built, new KPIs were introduced, and these were then kind of launched into the organization. And I think this uncovered a lot of maybe complexity that we weren't quite prepared for at the time, both in terms of how this is defined and set up, but also in terms of kind of the maturity within the organization of how to put this into use. I think there were a lot of requests for customer insights. We need to understand our customers. Great, there you go. Here's your customer insight. Yeah, that's nice. Not quite sure what to do about that, but let's move on. So there was kind of maturity going on, both on the, let's say, stakeholder side and within the analysis teams. So I want to go through a few points and learnings that we kind of picked up on the way here. And I want to start out with looking at a KPI, which is probably one of the more common ones, at least if you're in a kind of a subscription service type industry. So this is the retention rate, and in this case we're looking at the 12-month retention rate, which is defined quite simply as the number of households or customers that had active products with us 12 months ago and are still active or have active products with us today, divided by the number of households that had active products with us 12 months ago. So how many of those customers that were here 12 months ago have we retained? They're still here today. And this is, I've kind of removed the values here, but this green little line shows the development of the overall Nordic retention rate for If. So it's a happy story, stuff is going up without telling you how much up. And in fact, when we kind of looked into this a little bit, we saw that that pretty much holds true for each of the countries and within lots of different groups of customers. So this retention thing is developing maybe mysteriously well. And this gave rise in turn to a number of questions that we wanted to look into to kind of understand what is driving this development. Clearly, technical errors and things like that we could sort out, but can we understand how this KPI works in practice? So to illustrate one aspect of that and kind of one hypothesis that we looked into, I want to talk about how the retention rate changes as your portfolio ages. So this is the blue kind of bar chart over there shows the distribution in terms of customers split by the durationship. So how long have they been customers? And I think it's not an untypical picture for especially kind of the larger insurance providers in the Nordics, that you have a large base of your customer or a large part of your customer base, which is customers who have been here for a long time. They have 10 plus years duration. They've been your customers for a very long time. And then as you kind of go down, you have an influx of new customers. For this example, we're going to say that that's fixed at 420,000 new customers per year, say. And as you move forward and kind of, let's say, simulate this year over year, those customers transition from 0 duration to 1 duration, etc., depending on the retention rates. So hopefully you get the picture. And here we've set the retention rate as a function of duration. So we've kind of just fixed those values, and those values remain unchanged. So what I'm going to do now is kind of staging this as a basis, all other things equal, what happens to your portfolio and what happens to your retention rate as you move forward and your portfolio slowly ages in terms of duration. Hopefully that made sense. So first year, you start out with a 12-month retention rate of 89.6%. And in the initial stages here, that remains pretty much constant. It actually dips a little bit to begin with, and then it starts to increase. So we're moving forward in years now, and you'll notice that the increase is increasing, so to speak. So the retention rate is increasing more and more year over year as we go forward. And by the time we've reached year 10, we've had a nice little increase. So the main point of this exercise, obviously it's a complete oversimplification of how the retention rate develops, but it does highlight a point to be aware of. especially if you have a very skewed portfolio, that as your portfolio ages, a retention rate defined along these lines will naturally go up over time. And there are lots of other factors that can contribute in similar manners. Key point and learning here being that, fine, introduce these new KPIs, but there's a lot of maturity that has to happen in terms of how to understand these and how to use this. A lot of hypotheses that need to be tested, looked into, dug into, and understood in detail before this really can start to provide value to the organization as a whole. Before that, it's a bit of a black box mystery number. So the graph that I showed you previously, obviously it was taken from a report. And the next point that I want to talk a little bit about is how this is done in practice. Kind of coincidentally, around the same time that we shifted to this kind of customer orientation mindset, we were also developing a new Nordic data model for our first-party data, so all our kind of core data for our customers and products. So this was contained in a Nordic data model, which was, quite flexible and reusable for a number of purposes. The retention picture that I showed you is pulled out of a Tableau report. We use a combination of Teradata and Tableau for most of our kind of data visualization. From one of these kind of high-level strategic reports that we have where we track these numbers. The picture that you're looking at here is a mapping of all the respective tables and views, so basic SQL stuff, that feeds into at least the old version of that report. I'm happy to say it doesn't quite look like this anymore. So each of these little blue and black circles are separate tables and views that have been built on top of what was, I should point out again, originally a Nordic underlying data structure. Now, at the time, this was pretty good. This was the first attempt at kind of consolidating some Nordic definitions and setting this thing up. But in retrospect, there's a few learnings that we can pick out of it. Firstly, one issue that you get here right away is that all your definitions, all your business logic, so what do you say is a customer? What's a household? Do you want to count customers who have certain niche products as customers, or do we want to kind of keep them out of that KPI and so forth? All of that logic is hidden away in all of these views and tables. And in order to find them, if you're lucky enough that the analyst who built it is still around, you can go and ask him, but most probably someone is going to go in and have to dig into this to figure out very basic questions. Secondly, it's a nightmare to maintain, obviously. And there's a whole bunch of software development practices type things that I could point out here. I was actually, just so you don't think I'm throwing crap at the people who did this, I was one of the people who did this. I was responsible for the Norwegian branch. And that one might look nicer. It's smaller than the other ones, a lot less views and tables involved. But the reason for that is the next point I'm learning here. For Norway, we happen to have a nicely built access layer view, which kind of the data engineer team had built. So the starting point for developing such a report was a lot shorter. It was a lot easier. And that brings me to the other kind of key learning here, that I think when developing these types of things, and I was happy to hear Niall mention kind of the neat data earlier today, putting some effort into how these data structures are built, also when the analysts go in, is absolutely key. And that needs to be done in collaboration with people who actually know how to structure data in a good way. The other point here is, of course, that there's an enormous scope of reusability involved here. These are the key kind of core parts of your business that you want to be able to reuse in a lot of contexts. When it's as messy as this, you can't. Now, another thing that we experienced when looking at these kind of high-level reports is that the strategic element of the business gets disconnected from the operational element. What I mean by that is that, let's take an example through cross-sell, which is another typical KPI that you're interested in having. So when we talk about cross-sell, we simply mean to what extent you're succeeding at upselling your existing customers, adding products to them, increasing your share of wallet. So in principle, pretty basic to explain what you mean. In a high-level report where you track cross-sell according to some kind of definition, fine, that's kind of your top-level KPI for your entire business, and your cross-sell is going down. It's not developing the way you like, and you start looking for explanations. you need to be able to connect that to what's going on operationally within your respective channels. So, maybe your outbound telemarketing operations is reporting that things are going great and we're increasing cross-sell, and it doesn't really reflect to that high-level world that you're looking at, and you have no way of connecting it because the data is completely disjointed. These have been developed separately, things are defined separately, and it's very hard to connect the dots. Just so this doesn't become too negative, because I'm focusing on a lot of the stuff that we saw that kind of didn't work the way we would have liked it to, I wanted to end with a bit of stuff that we've been doing more recently and that we've been exploring in terms of how to describe our customer base. And it's very tempting to call this a segmentation project, and I really don't want to, because I don't think of it as a segmentation project, and I'll try to explain why. I think the other point to start out with mentioning here is that I showed you the horrible picture of the data feeding into the report. This actually started out simply because we did a refactoring of all that. So we went in and said, okay, let's rebuild this. Let's make this in a different manner where we can reuse it for different kinds of things. And after that, we were kind of looking around and saying, okay, so we have this thing now, and we have a replacement report. Things are good. Are there kind of use cases and things that we haven't really attacked before, simply because they were too complex and kind of the collection and assembly of data for those tasks was too daunting? And this came up as one thing. So the idea here being essentially to be able to split your customer base into segments, for lack of a better word. Now, these are not segments as in, life cycle segments where you're talking about happy seniors and newly established families and so forth. These are, in one sense, a very kind of inside-out segmentation approach, where we just want to be able to describe, okay, we have 3.1 million customers right now. What kind of customers do we have? How many of those customers belong to certain segments and groups? How would we describe them in terms of what relationship they have with us in terms of their products? We acquired more than 100,000 customers during the beginning of 2018. Super. What kind of customers were they? How happy should we be about that? So, simple way to do that is to define this around your core products. So you have, in this kind of slightly simplified model, we have, let's say, 5 core product segments. The top one being the customers who have no core products with us. Core products now being your car insurance, home insurance, and personal insurance products. Then you have the group of customers who only have as a core product their car product, the group who only has the home insurance, the group who has car and home, and then your kind of premium segment who has all 3 of your core products. Now, the first thing you can do is you can describe these a little bit. You can talk about what kind of customers you have within this group. You can even define some form of strategy for these customers. So, how do we typically want to think about these things? And there were essentially 3 governing principles going into this in terms of how we wanted to do it. We didn't want to go in starting out with some unsupervised learning to find the correct segments, because we wanted to start out pretty simple. We wanted something that was explainable. If you had to read a 20-page document to understand what the segment was, it wouldn't work. So it had to be simple to explain, but we also wanted to capture the core, let's say, transitions that we see within our business. So what do I mean by that? Typically, a lot of new customers coming into us come in through our car dealer channel. They're single car kind of product type customers. One of the things we obviously want to do is we want to transition them to being more complete customers with multiple products. If the model doesn't capture those transitions, so you can't track how many customers transition from that phase to another, then the model isn't going to work very well. Finally, the third kind of principle we worked according to is that we would like to group customers to the best we can according to the first 2 in some form on how they're kind of, let's say, how we attribute value to those customers. I would have liked to talk a bit more about the use cases here. I also see that I'm very quickly running out of time. So I think I'm going to simply cut it there and skip a few slides on how we applied this. We use this largely to kind of track different types of transitions within the base. That was the very short version. And say thank you very much.